Hallo vrienden, het is 10 uur ochtends in Redmond, dus tijd voor .NET API review. And that would be an attempt today at Dutch. So, um, yeah, we have fewer reds than we did last week, which is good because we're running out of time for .NET 9, but we still have a whole lot of stuff labeled .NET 9. So let's see if we can continue last week's productivity and knock like a dozen of these out. First up, new overloads for named wait handles that enable creating or opening user-specific synchronization primitives 102682. Count.
Yes. Um, so this one is basically we have for the named wait handles we have mutex, event, and semaphore. Um, these came from Windows, and they've always been all user scope in the sense if you create one of those with a particular name, like process shared mutex, then a process running as a different user can open it. The only um, scoping that it enables in Windows is between whether it is only visible in the current session, the current terminal session, or if it's visible across all sessions. Um, so, for instance, services in Windows typically run in a particular login session, and they can different processes can share mutex between just them, and then other login sessions will have a different namespace for their named event wait handles. Um, so the Linux implementation basically mirrored the same kind of stuff, except the definition of a session is different. Each shell has its own session. Um, so but it works similarly. So, for instance, processes that run in trees with a parent-child relationship, those processes can share a session local mutex, or you can make it a global mutex and have any process share. But there's no real user restriction between these. Any users can open these things. So we wanted to add, similarly to what was done for named pipes, we wanted to add a way to create these named wait handles with that are restricted to the creating user, so that only processes running as that user can open them. And on Linux in particular, these we use some memory mapped files that are stored under /temp, and those are currently, because there was previously no user restriction, those are currently accessible by any user, and there can be some tampering that could be done there. So we want to be able to add a user-specific version that would be stored in the appropriate place with the appropriate permissions, etc., so that only that user can access them and operate on them. So what I'm proposing is this named wait handle options that would be added as a parameter to the existing APIs that have a string name parameter, where we have current user only. It's a flags enumeration with current user only and all users, and also current session only and all sessions. So I figured it would be clear to just add that in as well. Previously, we have the local backslash and global backslash prefixes that are not very clear to indicate that they refer to sessions and not users, and that has been mistaken before to refer to users. So thought it would be clearer to similarly add the same kind of thing into the enum for sessions as well.
So,
And then,
yeah,
yeah.
seems like current user only and all users are two sides of the same coin, and current session only and all sessions are similarly two sides of the same coin.
Yes, I would agree.
Okay, so that's not a good flag enum definition because you should be able to specify all bits, and that would mean be yourself and everyone, and your session and everyone. So
Okay.
each of these two
Yeah.
things should only be one flag. It's
Okay.
either on or off,
So
right? Like,
yeah, I had exception conditions for those. Like one of these has to be set and not both, things like that. But if we want it to be separate, then maybe we can just start with doing just the current user only and all users, in a different, with a different name as well for the enum.
well, again,
I'm not
you
sure.
can't have both of these. They're the same thing. The bit is either set or it's not.
Right, it would just be a boolean, I guess. Yeah, yeah,
Right.
we would just do a boolean. Okay.
Or
Okay.
if you want the options, it's just a bit that would be all users, and if not set, then it's limited to the current user, and another bit for all sessions, and if not set, is limited to the current session.
That's possible too. That might be good as well. Um, let's see. Um, yeah, I'm not imagining that there would be too many other things that we would add to this enum in the future. I just called it options in case there's something like, for instance, if we wanted to do a non-recursive mutex, I guess it kind of would be doable, but Windows doesn't actually support that. It could be implemented. We could track that ourselves and do that. But yeah, actually no, that wouldn't work either. So I don't anticipate things to be added to this. So yeah, maybe, well, for pipe options, we have current user only in that. So maybe we can do just current user only and current session only. Does that work?
That means that the zero value slash the default would be all users and all sessions.
Um, oh, so it would have to be the other way around. All users and all sessions.
Right.
Got it. Okay.
If you want somebody, passing default of options to mean current user on the current session, which is the most restrictive, so
Right.
sounds like the best default.
Yes, I would want that as the default. Okay. Makes sense. Yeah, and then the next part is just adding the new versions of the existing APIs with that new enum.
Okay. Chad is asking, do the current file permission and access mask enums not already cover these scenarios?
No, because by design they need to be accessible by different users, so they're stored with all user permissions.
Okay.
With regards to the defaults, there's already a constructor for mutex today that just takes a name, for example, right?
Right.
And how is it? What behavior does it have relative to named wait handle options? Because the default is sort of not providing a named wait option. So ideally, if we were designing the whole thing from scratch, not providing a named wait handle options and providing named wait handle options 0 effectively would be the same thing. Now maybe we can't do that because of the legacy behavior, but I'm curious what that relationship looks like.
So the current ones have to be all users and current session only, the one without the enum, by default, because that's for compat. The idea here was that the current overloads would be deprecated eventually, to kind of force users to make a choice. But yeah, those would be conflicting defaults if we were to add the new ones with different defaults.
Okay. I mean, it still might be the right thing to do, but it does lead to a little bit of friction.
So what I was thinking, that's why, is Like if we were to just pass in default for the enum, it would throw an exception because no, it needs an explicit choice.
Right, but that goes back to what you had was the same option specified in bits 1 and 2, and then the same option specified in bits 3 and 4, just
Right.
forcing you to say not 0. One of the other things is all flags enums have to name the 0 value, and either none or default, depending on which one makes more sense. And the default value should generally be viable.
So this may just be a case
Right.
where we have to accept the fact that not providing options and providing none aren't the same thing.
Right.
Right. Unless we wanted to change from the named bits are all users in all sessions to current user only in all sessions to indicate that it's by default all users. But which, I mean, we can, just if we're trying
Yeah.
to make the new thing be slightly more, the defaults we think people
We
want more.
could.
Yeah. Ideally, what I'd like is whatever it looks like, I'd want there to be no default. Because it's also not clear, not very clear that the default currently is current session only. And people figure that out through trial and error and then realize, oh, okay, it needs to be global.
This might be a case. I mean, I know generally we prefer enums when there's multiple Boolean choices, but it's possible this is a place where actually having multiple Booleans and you have to explicitly specify is a clearer direction. I don't know.
Yeah,
That works.
if if the pattern that you're going for is that someone needs to make explicit choices, then that would make them individual formal parameters.
That sounds good to me. Should we do both, just for clarity for sessions as well? The 2 Booleans?
One for users and one for sessions?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
Okay.
so.
So I'll do the bool all users, something like that, and bool all sessions, and then passing in false would be the recommended thing to do. For the most restrictive thing, anyway.
So that would be
So
this, if everybody's happy with those names.
This doesn't conflict with any other existing constructors, does it? I don't have them memorized.
I don't believe it does. No. The existing ones are just below the proposed ones.
So we have a prefix, yeah. So the only bools are the initially owned, which is here.
Yeah, I put the parameter after the name because the other weight handle types don't have any other options before the name, and they're specific to the name, the visibility and restrictions of the name.
All right. So is everybody content with bool all users and bool all sessions?
Sounds good to me.
One alternative. How about all user scope, all sessions scope? Does that clarify anything, or is it necessary?
Mm.
I thought I heard somebody else try to say something when Count started speaking, but I guess not.
Well, one suggestion I had in chat was just instead of doing individual bools, have an options type instead of having it, the enum have a destruct with Boolean properties on it. Because it is a bit noisy in the sense that we have now 5 overloads that all we have to keep in sync. Having a name type for it might make things easier in the future if you have to add another thing for it. And then I think my other question was, is this a Windows only concept or is it a cross-platform concept?
I didn't follow the first question, but for the second question, this is for Mutex. We have similar implementation on Unix as well. Events and semaphores, we don't. They're not supported. The cross-process events and semaphores are not supported on Unix. So those would just throw platform not supported.
Gotcha.
And these restrictions would also be applied to Windows as well. So if you were to create an event with current user and current session, that would do the appropriate thing on Windows as well.
Yeah, my first question was because right now the design was originally an enum-based approach where the options type is just an enum. We could make it a struct with named Boolean properties instead of having those. And then that might make things easier if in the future we have to add one more flavor to this, right? Because right now we have a bunch of overloads now where we have to keep the order of all users and all sessions and all this, in sync. I'm not sure that makes things easier or worse.
I see. So we would initialize the struct and then pass that in.
Yeah. I mean, the nice thing with a struct is also you could have named defaults, right? If you really wanted to.
True.
If you wanted the user to, or if you wanted the caller to have opinions on things, a struct won't facilitate that because you can pass default of T. You can just write the word default and move on.
Well, which is basically all false, but yeah. Which is, more or less the same what you would do with individual parameters, right?
That was also stated as the most secure and most desirable thing, right?
But that would also
it's not
potentially create this. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say it's still different from the default today in terms of you don't pass anything, but maybe that's just something to give up on.
Yeah, like new mutex name versus new mutex name comma default have different defaults. Or we can just say, however the struct is initialized, an uninitialized struct is an exception condition. It has to be initialized.
Just throwing it out there, Count, how massive a breaking change would it be if we changed the default behavior today?
It would be pretty massive because it's mostly the I think it would be because on Windows especially, these mutexes are actually going to be restricted, and there might be processes with different permissions. For instance, there are services that run as different users to limit their security, and they need to be able to communicate with one another. That may not work with the new default.
Are we too late in the preview cycle to just ship this in a preview and see what whether anybody complains.
I'm planning to get this out for preview 7.
And then after 7 it's just RC, right?
Yeah.
Like 2 RCs.
Sure, but
Yeah. Yes, by the time 7 comes out, RC1 is done. And so that would mean there is one chance to take feedback.
right. And it's just a very narrow window, right? I think the concern that I would have with these kind of things is that it seems like it's niche in the sense that it's probably not impacting everyone. And the people that are impacted by this are very specialized, but those people are potentially very screwed by this change. So it's a bit hard to assess the severity of it.
It would be broken by changing the way that the string only constructor behaves.
Right.
So my thought again was that I was hoping that we could deprecate those eventually. So that problem, if we can do that, would be temporary.
No, and in fact, there isn't a string only constructor. So we might be being concerned about a problem that doesn't exist.
Well, it's the open existing and try open existing one, presumably, right?
Open existing isn't going to set permissions though. That wants one that already exists.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah,
So
fair enough.
What's the overload? What's the fourth overload there? The Boolean string Boolean.
So open existing wouldn't change the permission, but on Unix's specify like current user versus all users, they will also have a different namespace. So it'll have to. It's necessary so that it can open the correct mutex.
meaning the name they have to pass into open existing would change?
No, as in you can have 2 different mutexes with the same name, one with current user only and one with all users, in different namespaces at the same time. Because these are shared memory files and they'll be stored in different locations with the appropriate permissions.
When you say namespaces, what does it mean? Is that a prefix of name, or is it just the way the object manager and the kernel stores it? So if you give them the same simple name but different permissions, they end up in different namespaces. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's the latter one.
Okay.
Sessions work the same way in Windows. So current session and all sessions are different namespaces.
So if there's a
But
global one and a local one, when you call open existing, it tries the local one first?
so if you don't specify a prefix when you're opening, it defaults to the local, and it'll open the local only.
Yeah, but I guess on Windows you have to specify in the name, the namespace.
Yeah.
So you have to say local or global.
Yeah.
Right. So these options that you want to add don't affect that.
Not for sessions, no. But like with these options, you would be able to just specify the name without a prefix, and then specify that you want it to be all sessions. That would basically create a mutex with a global prefix.
Fair enough. But right, so the point that I was bringing up is we were talking about what is the behavior of mutex of string. We don't have one of those. So we have mutex of bool string, but not one with just string. So talking about the behavior of this constructor, there is no constructor to compare it to. This one we can compare it to.
The first one is analogous to mutex with no arguments without a name. So an unnamed mutex with no arguments, where the mutex is not initially owned.
Well, but it's not analogous to one with no name because it has a name.
In the sense, like, for the unnamed constructors, we have one that doesn't have the Boolean initially owned, where it's implied that it's not going to be initially owned.
Right, but we were talking about somebody doing this and how that was going to be different from that. But this line of code you can't write. That's a compile failure. There's no pattern that you can pass just a string.
Yeah, so technically we have that constructor is just missing currently. It could be there. What it would mean is that it would be
but it doesn't
with that name. Yeah,
which means there's no breaking change. There's nothing to break.
Yes, correct.
Now there is this one. So we would be talking about introducing a break in this one, but just to be clear, if we're talking about this simple constructor at the top, there is actually no analogous constructor.
Well,
I mean, I
would
think
it be breaking anyway.
Well, it's less breaking. I think the point was more. I think the point that you raised, Colin, was more like there's a certain pattern here where you can specify the new booleans either as the options type or as individual booleans, or you can omit them. And some combinations of arguments are valid today, like owned comma string, for example, is. And you're saying, well, we could have one that doesn't take the owned, and then it would be equivalent for both sides.
Sure.
And I think the point that Jeremy is making is it's breaking in the sense that it's a bit weird to say there's an overload that takes additional data, and if you specify the default values for those, they don't correspond to the one that omits them entirely. So it's kind of like it's not breaking, it's more like a mismatch in expectations, I guess.
Yeah.
And that is especially problematic, I think, if you want to combine it with, let's deprecate the old ones that don't take those additional states, because then the question is, how do you want users to convert to the new one, right? And I think they need a mental model for, well, what I currently have, what does it correspond to with the new APIs, right? And so what is the tweak that I'm supposed to make? But I think, in my opinion, I think it's a bit more nuanced. I think we already have cases where you can't pass in null for the additional state. Like there's some default value you can pass in, and default behavior is some well-known singleton somewhere or some other behavior. So I don't think it's entirely bad to say, yep, it doesn't correspond to comma default. It's just some other default in sense of combination of flags. I think that's fine too. I think the question is, like, if you want to live in a world where the current pattern has stopped being used, and you want to deprecate them, I think you want to end up in a way where, okay, what's the minimum amount of code change that these people have to do in order to get to a compliant state, right? And you want that to be a one-liner almost. You don't want them to be, in some cases you pass in true comma false, in other cases false comma true, right? Like you want this to be almost like toolable. Of course, then you have the same problem that we talked about, the binary breaking change, right? If everybody makes the minimum change and it changes behavior, it's like, okay, what do they do then, right? What do we want them to do, I guess?
Right. But my understanding is Steve had asked how breaking it would be if we made the string-only constructor change its defaults to be single user, single session. And the answer is we actually don't have one of those. We have, the closest one is this bool initially owned comma name. So
which significantly decreases my concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think the argument still stands though, right? I think the question is the existing. If you take the new overloads that Count is proposing, and you remove the ones with the new arguments, for the ones that exist, why don't we just change their behavior, right? Because that one might not apply to the very first one, but it does apply to the Vex4 one, right?
Right.
There's
Just,
also like for
go ahead.
we don't have the constructor overload with without the initially owned parameter, but we do have one for the open existing and try open existing, so that confusion is still there for them.
Yeah.
Okay, and for open existing, you need these options because you don't want to probe multiple namespaces. You want to be more clear as to what namespace they're opening it in.
Yeah, the parameters affect where the namespace of the mutex.
But the
You could
current
be
one
open.
would still have to try both namespaces.
No, it would only try one. It would just imply the default of all users' current session.
So false, comma, false.
True, comma, false. Oh, sorry. Yeah, true, comma, false.
All users current session. I see.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not horrible, right? I mean, you could imagine that if we do what I suggested earlier, we have a wait handle options as a struct. If we really are offended by the fact that it's true, comma, false and not false, comma, false, we could change the name from all user scope to current user scope, and then false implies all. Or we could say we have a static property for the struct called, I don't know, default, that returns the struct with true, comma, false.
I don't want that to be the default, though. Maybe we could call it legacy default or something.
I mean, I think that's the question, right? So, like, I think the problem that we have is we think the current defaults are not secure enough. So we want people to use different values, but then the question is, what's the experience you want to deliver, right? So you basically have two options. You can either change the behavior of the current code, which basically means, they're just forcefully getting opted into the new behavior, and then they have a way to opt out, either by setting a compat flag or by calling a different method. Or we are basically saying, okay, we recognize the APIs with the insecure defaults and have an analyzer that warns them when they use one of them and tell the user, hey, you need to make a decision here. Call one of the other methods over here with specified thing, which is, I think, what you suggested, right? Which is you deprecate the current ones and you tell people, like, the current defaults are not secure, so please use a method that explicitly specifies the default so you know what you're getting.
I think it will be very hard to change the behavior of the current APIs, because when it refers to current session by default, it could end up using the wrong mutex, and then it may not be immediately obvious that some process running in a different session is actually opening a different mutex.
But you said the default is the current session only.
Yeah.
So the only thing that we would be changing the default of is it would go from all users to current user.
That's right. Yeah. So it's the flip argument, I guess. It's processes running as a different user would be opening a different
in the same session.
Different. In the same session, yes. But that's right.
So on a Windows interactive session, that's going to be basically never. And services running in session 0 would be the only thing affected in a general application.
So what does session mean in this context? I'm not familiar with that.
In Windows, it's a login session. But there are services where the child process runs as a different user or with specific restricted permissions, where it still communicates with the parent process, which has more permissions, and those kind of situations might run into it as well.
Right, but those so that's going to be services which are probably running in session 0 instead of in an interactive session.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unless Windows services don't run in session 0 anymore, in which case whatever session they run in, but it's not the current logon session of a user with a keyboard.
So I think
Right.
what he said was like, does it mean so if you have a process that basically does a logon user or whatever, and then spawns a child process on a different user account, that's still the same session, or that's a different session?
That's the same session.
So it's not just services then; it will also impact people that do what I just said, right?
Right, and now
Yeah.
how many processes do that in an average user interactive logon session? Approximately 0.
I mean, it's a small number. I would agree with that. I mean, it is an option. We could document it as a behavior breaking change, right? That's not unheard of. And then just tell people like, yep, you may have to call a new overload because you're in the less than 1 percentile.
Yeah. Like, I think if we're trying to make a new thing and reduce the permissions and we're concerned about the shape of this, I can find the shift key, I think we just change the default in 9 to say it's current user, current session, and we add an app context switch that says, hey, I can't switch to your new API, but fix my permissions
Yeah.
to be what they used to be.
I mean, I kind of agree with Count though. Like the problem is if you have that issue, it might be very hard to troubleshoot, right? Because you're basically still creating the mutex, or you're still binding to a mutex, and it's in the wrong scope. So your
No,
synchronization.
it's in the right scope.
Right? Well, I mean,
The-
it's in the
the-
right scope in the sense
The
that
session is the scope. You'll just get a permission error. Access denied. That's much clearer than this name doesn't exist.
Oh, so you're saying, I see what you're saying. So it fails rather than just silently creating one in the wrong scope.
Well, imagine like the multi-process application where there's some communication with these things. One is upgraded to .NET 9 and the other one is not. They could be looking in different places.
Yeah, that's kind of what I
Sorry,
meant. So I think my concern is if you say something like open existing or try open existing, you just get the wrong answers now, right? Because you're looking in the wrong place.
Does the all users or current user change the name spacing of the mutex?
Yes.
Okay, because previously I had understood you to say it was only the all sessions versus current session.
That's only on Windows. So on Windows, the security restrictions for making it current user only, that only affects the security of the mutex. It doesn't affect the namespace.
Yeah.
On Unix, both of them affect the namespace.
It's even better now, right? Because if you actually are impacted now by this, like the scenario that Count outlined where you upgrade one of your code bases and not the other, not only do you get like potentially hard to diagnose errors, they also differ based on operating system. So
Yeah, but people who use Linux are smart enough to understand error messages. Otherwise, they wouldn't have got it to boot.
well, that's a very. I don't think that's quite true. I mean, if you look at cloud programming, I mean, in fairness, if you do a cloud service, you're probably not like spinning up processes as much. So like, I still stand by what I said earlier. I think it's a fairly narrow set of users, but I think the argument still stands as well, which is if you are impacted by this, it's not immediately obvious what went wrong, right? Because you get like weird behavior in your app, potentially depending on how you handle those cases, right? But I think this comes back to like, what do we want the world to be, right? If we really think the current behavior is bad, and we also feel like changing the behavior of the current methods is too impactful, then the only alternative is we have to effectively say all the current methods are deprecated and we flag them and say, please call the other APIs, right? That's the only thing that makes sense, I think. Which is still doable. I mean, it's not unheard of. We have done this in other places. It just seems to suggest that we add a whole bunch of new APIs across all threading primitives, and then deprecate all the existing ones. That seems like a very heavy hammer.
Yep. Or just accept that these two things are different.
Which again, like I think I'm okay with that. I think it still means though, like if we have both of them, then well, we don't want people to call the existing one, right?
Right.
So
I do think that them being different is an easier pill to swallow if the old one is marked as obsolete.
yeah,
Also, especially if the second one would throw, as in a default, is not an acceptable parameter.
well, I mean, depends on how you model this, right? But like, I don't know, like if you say, are you saying false comma false is invalid as a combination?
Now he wants a
It's not.
secret extra boolean that he sets to
So,
true
yeah.
whether you call any setters.
I mean, you could, but like that seems
It's sort of like if we have a nullable of bool, an uninitialized
I mean,
bool would be invalid.
yeah.
Yeah.
There's a state for that. We call
Well,
it null.
yeah. I mean, yeah. That I mean that like, boom, fixed it. Now you can't pass default. Like,
Yeah, which seems reasonable, right? I mean, these types you could just store, right? They're
Yeah.
not. But
if it's a reference type, default is null, and don't allow null. Now you
I mean,
force
to
someone
be
to make
honest though,
options.
like I'd be fine with a struct and then just tell like if you say default, yeah, you just pass in the equivalent of false comma false. If that's not what you wanted, then don't do that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that seems fair and fine too. Like, I mean, I think default in C# is well defined. I mean, people know that it's the memory is all zero, right? So if that's not what you wanted, then don't do that.
All right. So far we've talked about these two shapes, and we've talked about this type being a flag xenum. We've talked about it being a struct, and we've talked about it being a class.
I think
So-
my preference would be make it a struct, and yeah, have it just as named Boolean properties. The reason why I prefer having a dedicated type is because in the docs, that also makes it easier to refer to these new pattern of APIs. You would just say prefer the one that takes the named white handle options argument rather than prefer the one that takes the following booleans, right? That seems a bit weird to refer to. And if you ever have to add another thing to it or you want to put a spin on it, like we have a place to do it rather than having to do it manually across several overloads. I don't think we need to do anything special for default. I would just say, yep, it's just equivalent of newing up the struct and setting everything to false. Because that's what it means in all other cases.
And we want that to be the most locked down state, not the current default state.
I guess, yeah.
Because the other option would be that the default is the current default.
Yes. I think that makes sense, right? If we think the current default is wrong, then it does seem weird to go out of our way to make the new thing behave wrongly by default.
Right.
So if we use a struct, I'm a bit confused about what the properties should look like if the default value would be. Are we saying the default value would be invalid
No,
for the struct?
the default value is current user, current scope, or current user, current session.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay, that works.
So it is. We're in this state here where these two adding comma default will change what scope you're in.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then, all right. So if we're looking at a struct. So now we can talk about what we want these properties to be named. So chat points out if this one is a scope on Linux but a permissions on Windows, it seems weird to call it scope because it's not always a scope.
Well, I mean, the concept is namespace and permissions, right? So, in that sense,
Well, this one's always namespace, and this one's namespace sometimes and permissions sometimes.
right.
So maybe we should
It's
just
kind
call
of a
it.
scope in the sense that it determines the visibility of it, right? I think the problem is that fundamentally there's not the one name because there's just differences across operating systems, right? And you can only have one Boolean to represent it. So, sorry, Count, you were saying?
Yeah, I was thinking that actually allow all users and.
I just remove the word scope.
Yeah.
Sure, that works. But then I guess I would also remove scope from sessions and I just keep them in sync. I would just say it's all sessions, all users, and then it's just documentation for yeah, I think I would just use the same naming pattern for both of them. I mean, allow all sessions seems fine. All sessions seems fine.
I wonder if allow would imply that if you were to disallow it, that you would get a failure instead of opening a mutex in a different namespace if one already exists.
So you just want all users, all sessions? The bottom pair?
Yeah. I like current user only and current session only. Because I'm not as confused by those.
I mean, so because these are properties and not fields, we can name them one thing and make their defaults be the other. Right? Like
Yeah, that's the problem.
no, but
yeah.
we can say current user only, and the false state means current user. Like the field that's backing this doesn't have to mean like when you say default, you could read current user only and it can say true.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean that's
because
the
this would
power
be
of having
How does that work?
not all
like
users.
I thought the
and set is
Oh, I see. Like that, yeah.
yeah. You just lie.
That works.
like that is a thing you can do with structs when you have it exposed as properties instead of fields.
Yeah.
The fields will all be set to 0, but you can make the 0 be the opposite of what you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course. That works for me. I like that.
And I think that makes sense. To some extent, that's documentation. I think that's fine.
Which is nice also because for hopefully the majority case where you don't have to do much, you can actually just pass in default and be fine with it. You only have to type extra code if you want to unrestrict something.
Right. It does mean that somebody would be passing in, new named wait handle options, current user only equal false, because they wanted to expand it. But if we think that current user only is the easier to describe state, then that's fine.
Yeah. So it feels like a lot of code to write to specify those things. But I mean, it looks better to write all user scope : false, all sessions or all users : colon false, or never mind, bool. If we had a bool current user only, then to say current user only colon false. That seems simpler, but I'm fine with the struct as well.
I mean, it's not that bad, right? I mean, I think in code, what you would do is you could do new open brace, right? Because you can use anonymous, you can basically use type inference there. But yes.
Okay, that's not too bad. Yeah.
I think like I'm less concerned about this because it doesn't strike me as one of those APIs you call left and right? There will be very few places where you will connect to mutexes. I think it's way more important that people understand what the code means they're writing rather than making that as terse as possible. And so I think that will be the thing I would focus on more here. Like if there were a collection type, right, where they do something smart about add or remove, sure, but this is more of a, pick the correct permission model for your threading APIs. That seems like something you want to get right.
Yeah, I actually like that you can't just pass in false true. You have to always look up which argument is this.
Yeah. Although, I mean, that's a kind of a code convention thing. I very rarely pass in true or false to a parameter. I almost always do the parameter colon value because, yeah, I never know what the fuck true or false means on the call side.
Isn't it true, though, like if you pass in a parameter name colon value and then you don't want to do the parameter name colon for the next argument, doesn't that...
It used to be the case. They fixed that in C#.
Okay.
I think it's one of the last versions in C# where they fixed that.
Excellent.
Which is why I've started doing it everywhere for Booleans.
Mm-hmm. Alright, so we get rid of flag xenum. Then
one other...
so do we want to say we're obsoleting all the existing members?
So what was that? Oh, will you obsolete them? Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, if you want to obsolete them, my only requirement is I don't care about the message as much as I care about the fact that they all have the same diagnostic ID, please.
Yep. Yeah, so...
What is the diagnostic ID?
It's basically the diagnostic that the compiler reports when you call one of those methods, because it used to be the fact that all obsolete messages share the same diagnostic ID. We changed it a couple of years ago so that so users can suppress them all, but more importantly, they also have one help topic that ties them all together rather than documenting them all separately.
Okay, cool.
Which I think looks like next will be syslib
Always
57. I'm gonna write down. If you want XXXX, then I'll write that down.
I mean, I don't care. I'm just saying, yeah, it's always the next one.
Yeah, I'm just trying to be helpful and provide guidance since there was confusion.
So given that there's only one preview, should we do the deprecation in .NET 9 as well, or should we do that in .NET 10?
I don't think there's any harm in, like, most people don't use previews, so
yeah,
somebody's going to go from 8 to 9, they're going to get an obsolescence warning. We're telling them go change your code because you upgraded to 9. Like, we don't need it's not obsolete as error, it's a warning, and that may, if any of our repositories are ingesting and are upgrading these warnings to errors, which they probably are, it'll mean that they'll have to make the changes as part of doing an upgrade. So maybe we roll them out in different weeks or something. But I think it's all .NET 9. Whether that's the same preview or different, that's up to, I don't know. I'll say Tobe because I think he's the one who usually has to handhold people on this.
Holy fuck.
Sorry, I missed. What am I hand holding people up?
People who get upset when we introduce warnings and they have warning as error turned on when they, like, if the ASP.NET repository has turned these warnings as errors, it's, do we give them a build where they have the new constructors but we haven't marked them as warning yet, and then wait for them to upgrade before we start slapping on these obsolescence? Or do we tell them, yeah, there's going to be some breaks, deal with it? Anyway, I think as far as API review is concerned, we're saying obsolete all existing, or all the existing things should be marked as obsolete. The timing on that is flexible.
One questions I have about this is, so we have the existing overloads that take mutex rights, for example, right, which are the Windows specific echo types. What is our guidance then? Are we basically telling people like you either use those or the one that takes named wait handle options, or are they kind of like, are they independent or are they related? It's just that if you're Windows only, then it doesn't matter which ones you pick.
Technically, for the ACL APIs, they're still necessary because you can use different permissions. But for the session scoping, it might make sense to extend that as well. But then I'm not sure if we'd want to use this struct for those. I think for those are kind of legacy or like Windows specific high, those are kind of advanced APIs when you want to set very explicit security. So maybe it's okay to just keep those the way they are.
That makes sense to me. The only question I have is, it sounds to me like, based on what you just said and the way I understand it, is that they can change the permissions, but they can't change the session. Is that fair?
They'd have to use the prefix method of changing that. And they are Windows specific, so they'd have to continue to do that.
I see, because they're already on Windows, they could do it by just changing the name of the type. Yeah. Gotcha. So then they wouldn't be marked as replicated, and it's just, I guess the assumption is if you call those, you already are explicit, so you shouldn't be surprised by what the thing does.
Right, and I'm supposing that in these new versions of the APIs, if the user does provide a prefix, local backslash or global backslash, that would override what is passed in the options, because it would be awkward to assume something by default and then have it not match the prefix.
I would say if they've specified a prefix and it doesn't match, that's an exception.
Okay.
So if they said local in current session, then great. But if they say global in current session, that's a make up your mind or get rid of your prefix.
Got it. That works.
One thing I would add is, like, I think if we do what we just suggest here, where we make the other ones obsolete and not change the behavior, I think it would be okay to say, maybe the next version for .NET 10, we are changing the behavior of the existing ones and match the new ones. Because at that point, it's like, yep, you had a version, we told you that this is a bad default. You should have moved to the new APIs where you get to specify which behavior you want. And if you still haven't done it, we would just force the new default to make sure that everybody is, secure by default.
Would you be concerned that people who just do LTS to LTS upgrades will have missed the middle state?
Maybe, but I mean, they still get obsolete warnings, right? The warning is still there.
That's true.
And I mean, I would generally say for me, the people that skip LTSs, it's like, I mean, there's no winning, right? I mean, unless you're willing to wait like 4 years, like you're gonna miss some things in the middle anyway. To
Sure.
me, the
Just
worst outcome is always if we silently change behavior and you don't get an exception, it's just, you may get outcomes you don't want, and you have no build diagnostics. That's always a very unfortunate outcome. But in this world, you would still get a build diagnostic at least, so oh yeah, there's something going on there. You at least know where to look.
as long as you rebuilt and not just did roll forward, but don't do
Yeah, I
roll
mean, people
forward.
that do roll forward, they, presumably they don't care about their quality. So,
So what's the difference between obsoleting it with a warning versus deprecating it with an error?
we don't have a deprecation thing really. Like it is obsolete what we have to give warnings. I mean, obsolete has obsolete as error, but like the problem with obsolete as error is basically you are preventing people from making progress, right? You're basically saying you can't even rebuild, which in almost all cases is not warranted, in my opinion. Like, unless you know for a fact this thing is never going to work ever, right? Which is almost never the case. You give him a warning and say, yeah, sorry, get new behavior. And if you didn't want that, then too bad. Um, but right now, nothing would change, right? They would get a warning, they get the old behavior, and then one version down the road, we may decide that's not good enough, and then we change the default behavior of those APIs.
Yep. Do we want to add something like
A public static.
all users in current session? I guess those are redundant. Like, do we want an accelerator for the current thing, or wait until people complain? Because if we do want an
Kind of love
accelerator, we
that.
have to name it.
I think most often people would either want current user in current session or current user in all sessions. The all user stuff is a bit less common, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think I like the idea of having an accelerator for the common cases. Because it will make the code more readable, right?
But they are all valid options, so.
So you want all four?
I think it's easy. No, I mean,
I
I think we could just let them specify it instead of having shortcuts.
Yeah, we can do that too. I mean, as Jeremy said, we could do this also after the fact when people complain. We have a place to put it. The only thing I'll suggest is just looking at usage data. Some of these APIs are used quite a bit. So we might get, like, this is a thing that will impact, and looked at the data, between 15 to 30% of code bases. So it's probably a more impactful obsolescence.
15 to 20% of code bases use this API directly.
Yeah, I just poked around for like some of the mutex APIs, some of the semaphore APIs. Mutex, I think the one that we have on screen right now, bool, comma, name, I think that was the one that was in the NetFX Compat Lab, that's 30% of apps.
Yeah,
that is remarkably high.
And that's a very biased.
Is that because are they also implemented with, like, is this part of my NVD injecting single app startup, singleton apps code into an application or something like that? That's just such a high number.
Think so, because this is all framework code that I wouldn't have indexed. I think, I mean, it's possible that it's just a shared library, right? Because it's basically .NET Framework Compat Lab apps tend to be very large. And again, they're desktop apps, right? So they do all sorts of interesting things. On Nougat.org, the numbers are all very low. They're like kind of what I expect them to be, less than 2% usually. So, I mean, again, like, if the app is large enough, everything shows up at some point, right?
All right, so for the remainder of the proposal, I think looks like it's the same shapes on adding the named wait handle options and then obsoleting all the old things.
Yeah, pretty much. For changing the behavior of the existing ones, maybe we can talk about that again in .NET 10 timeframe. Not sure about that yet.
So you said .NET Framework timeframe, is that what you said?
.NET 10 timeframe.
Oh, .NET 10, oh yeah, that one.
Did I say? I might have said framework. I don't know. I meant .NET 10.
Yeah.
Alright, so those are the changes we did. Let's flip that. Alright, I think I captured everything. Basically, flag xenum became a struct. It will default to true from both members, and we obsoleted everything.
Sounds right.
It's very few bullets for an hour's worth of work.
Paul, are you happy with this?
Yep, looks good to me.
Awesome.
Alright, chat asks, is API behavior changes the responsibility of API review? Emo, I'll let you answer.
I mean, yes and no. I mean, it's not something where we change the signature of things, right? But in the grand scheme of things, we care about usability of APIs, and that is in that realm of things we talk about. We do have opinions on breaking changes. We used to have a dedicated compat council. I don't think we have that anymore. So it's more or less brought up here.
All right. And next is Volatile Barrier APIs Niner 8837.
Right. So this one is proposing to add read and write specific barriers. In particular, they're like memory barrier acquire, memory barrier release with acquire and release semantics. Because they have the acquire and release semantics, which are the same behavior as volatile, they're on the volatile class. Read barrier and write barrier. These are explicit barriers. So there's some subtle differences between the explicit barriers and volatile read and volatile write in terms of ordering, but otherwise they have similar ordering restrictions.
What are the differences from volatile read and volatile write?
So volatile read, so they're both in the sense read. So volatile read and read barrier are both read write barriers in the sense reads and writes after the barrier can't move before. But let's say you have 3 reads. R1, R2, R3. And you want to have an ordering between R1 and R2 so that R1 happens before, between R1 and R3 such that R1 happens before R3. And you want to have an ordering between R2 and R3. So you want R2 to happen before R3 as well. So you want R1 and R2 to happen before R3, but you don't care about the ordering between R1 and R2. If you do volatile read, if you do volatile.read on R2, it doesn't guarantee any ordering between R1 and R3 because R1 can be moved after the volatile read, and then R1 and R3 can be swapped.
But if I did a volatile read on R3, that would prevent it from moving before R1 or R2.
But then R2 can move after R3.
If I do a volatile read, if I do a read on R1, a read on R2, or a read on R3, and the read on R3 is volatile?
Yeah, the read on R3...
Sure. Yes, right. It can move later, yes.
Yeah, but if we do R1, R2, and then volatile read barrier, and then R3, we get all those that we wanted.
Well, I know who needs to review my lock-free code. Anyway, yeah.
So I guess the thing I'm wondering is, what does the read barrier provide? What is this, because it's effectively a read barrier on all memory locations, not just on the one that I'm reading from?
It just has different ordering. Because it's an explicit barrier, it's effectively a full barrier between reads. So reads can't move either way across it. Whereas that's not true on a volatile read on a particular memory location.
Right. I see. It's confusing naming.
Yeah, it sort of is defined in the same way, but because it's an explicit barrier, the additional thing is that it's a full barrier for reads, and then a write barrier would be a full barrier for writes, in addition to the acquire and release semantics.
So we currently have...
Is there a reason we...
Go ahead, Steve.
Sorry. I was going to ask, historically we've had interlocks for full memory barriers and volatile for basically would it make more sense for these to be on interlocked if they're providing a full read barrier or full write barrier, and if they were instead interlocked read barrier and interlocked write barrier?
So we considered that. The confusion there is it's not just a read barrier and it's not just a write barrier, which is probably what most people would want, but the hardware typically implements it as acquire barrier and release barrier. ARM does have a full write barrier, which is not release semantics. It's weaker than release semantics. So in the sense, the read barrier also blocks writes from moving before it. And the write barrier blocks reads from moving after it. So it's not just a read barrier, and it's an acquire barrier.
But we didn't want to name it acquire barrier.
I'm sorry?
We didn't want to name it acquire barrier.
Maybe, but if it's on the volatile class, that would be implied because it's similar to volatile.read. It has acquire semantics.
Well, but it's similar in one way, but different in another. So I'm not sure why we're prioritizing one aspect of the naming over another.
I think that's just a subtle difference from the fact that it's an explicit barrier versus a read on a memory location. Right now, we don't use acquire and release anywhere in the APIs, so although it is, I think, spec'd out in the behaviors of Volatile.
And maybe it's because of a confusion because of existing naming, but like interlocked.read serves as a full memory barrier, not just for the specific location being read, right?
Right.
But volatile read does not. So maybe that's the fundamental difference in.
So if we want to call it acquire memory barrier or memory barrier acquire or something like that, then it would probably make sense to put that on interlocked.
So the problem with that is you and Vance and the 78 other people in the world who understand what acquire and release mean know what that means, and to other people it's going to sound like open a memory barrier and let it go. Like memory barrier acquire sounds like get memory barrier. Memory barrier release is like I'm done with it now. Because I saw that alternative proposal and I'm like, oh yeah, that totally looks like getting free. And that's not what they mean. So I think maybe being a little imprecise in the naming to make it where people understand what it does is better.
It's hard to get the naming right. Like even we also briefly discussed in this chat about adding an overload of memory barrier that takes a parameter similar to C++ with all the different ordering options. But even there, you have to read into what they actually do to understand what it does. It's not all that clear from just the name.
Yeah, so the question I was going to ask was, since we have memory barrier on both thread and interlocked, though it looks like interlocked is where we think it actually belonged, why are these on volatile and not interlocked?
The ordering semantics are closer to volatile read than to full memory barrier.
Because volatile has acquire semantics, right? But I knew what that meant. To be honest, I'm not one of the 78 people who feels like they fully understand that.
Volatile reads have acquire semantics.
Okay. And then the writes have the release semantics.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm pretty sure when we were in building 25, I asked that question near Vance once, and he explained something. And that tells you how much I understood it.
I guess it's fine here. I mean, I assume, I haven't read the full discussion. I assume Jan and Vladimir and you are all sort of on the same page that this is the right place with the right names.
Yeah, Jan is fine with either way. Interlock.memory barrier acquire release or volatile.read barrier. And I think, yeah, generally I think we've agreed on this for the most part. Like, it would be confusing to have interlock.read memory barrier. Because that would imply that it's only a read barrier. It's weaker than a, I'm sorry, it's, yeah, it's stronger than just a read barrier. In that sense, I guess it's okay, but yeah, it's not. It doesn't make it clear. Like, we may actually want to have just a read barrier and just a write barrier, because I think those are useful when you actually want to put these explicit one-way barriers. Like in that example that I gave, you have 3 reads and you have specific ordering restrictions on those 3 reads. You don't care about writes at that point. So what you actually need is just a full read barrier. So it would overlap with that name. So we would have to call it acquire memory barrier or memory barrier acquire. When it's on volatile, I think that kind of behavior is implied because it's more similar to volatile.read. It's just that because it's a separate barrier, an explicit barrier, it has slightly different behavior, which is just necessary because it's a separate barrier. It's not different.
I just want to double check
that.
I'm confusing myself. So let's switch to writes because they're easier to reason about. So if I have write 1, write 2, write 3, write variable 1, write variable 2, write variable 3, and I mark the variable 1 as volatile. So I basically do a volatile.write. That write cannot move past the later 2 writes, correct?
So we have volatile write for the write 1. So then we're doing.
Can the writes on 2 and 3 move earlier than the write on 1? The writes on 2 and 3 are not volatile. The write on 1 is volatile.
Yeah, so technically write 2 and 3 could move before that write 1.
Then logically I know that's the case, but I don't then understand what it means for what is prevented by having it be volatile, just in relation to another volatile write or in relation to another read or write on the location of variable 1.
Well, it's typically used, like, for instance, if we were to do volatile write on write 3, then it would guarantee that that would happen after write 1 and 2.
I mean, I always think of this in terms of locks and a lock release being store release semantics, and it's possible for things after a lock to move inside of it. So what you're saying makes sense, but then I'm trying to the purpose then of the write on volatile on variable 1 is if there were any non-volatile writes before that, they could not move past it, correct?
Yeah.
That's the whole purpose of the lock release being store release.
Yeah.
So in the read example that was said earlier and inverting things, you said that if the read on you had done a read on variable 1, a read on variable 2, and a read on variable 3. It would be if there was a read on variable 4 after a volatile read on 3, the read on 4 could not move earlier than 3. Right. Okay. Never mind. I am confused.
Another reason for putting it on volatile is if we have a read or memory barrier acquire and memory barrier release, those would also, like if we choose in the future to add more explicit barriers, which could actually currently be used for lock, but we don't have them, then it might make sense to do that with an overload with a parameter rather than to have all the different variants as separate methods.
So in a world where we add these APIs now, and volatile.read barrier actually means that any reads or writes after it can't move to before it. Right? That's how we're defining it.
Yeah.
And any reads before it can't move to after it as well.
Yes.
What would we call a single API that we added that was just acquire semantics? That was just reads, I guess just reads and writes after it can't move to before it.
I'm sorry, I didn't get the question. What was the question?
What you were saying it would be easier to add. We might actually want to add a less strong, a weaker version of this in the future. What would we call that weaker version?
So the way we were talking about it in this particular discussion is we were calling them like read-read-write barrier or read-write-write barrier. That makes it clear which way, where things have to stay.
Right. That corresponds, what you just said corresponds to these two APIs. The top one is read-write, is read-write, and the latter one is read-write.
Yeah, read-write-write.
For those of us who are mostly clueless right now, can you explain what the hyphen and your notion?
So whatever
the hyphen is where the hyphen is where the barrier is, and so can the things before the barrier move to after the barrier, and can the things after the barrier move to before it? So, if you had if volatile read barrier has read-read-write semantics, that's saying that it prevents reads that are before the barrier from moving later, and it prevents reads and writes that are after the barrier from moving earlier. But it doesn't say anything about writes before the barrier.
Effectively, it's a barrier to whatever's on the left of the hyphen and whatever's on the right of the hyphen from moving in the other direction.
Right. So, okay. So writes before read barrier can be later.
Yeah.
Because they were not described in your gate here. Okay.
So getting back to my question count, so if we wanted to add the equivalent of what I get, I guess would be just dash read write rather than read write. What would that be called?
I don't think I followed the question.
Sorry. Again, if I wanted to add a version of this API that had just acquires things,
just
what would I call
acquires.
You were saying
you mean
there might be use in the future for having a weaker version of this.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah. So like read. You mean like that
is
one?
dash read write like a possible thing? Like literally, like anything can be moved faster, but or after, but like the read and writes can't move before. Is that a thing? Is that sensible?
Yeah,
Like
for a
nothing
lock.
dash read write. Yeah.
I
Oh,
actually thought
nothing
that's
dash
what
read write.
I thought that's what acquire semantics were. Nothing dash read write. That anything could move, like anything could move into a lock, but nothing could move out of it.
No, I believe according to the spec, they are read dash read write, and the instructions behave that way too.
So you always get a stronger guarantee in that sense.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, from a hardware perspective, anyway, stores are typically not reordered with one another, but from a compiler perspective, they would be still behaving as read dash read write for an acquire. Because a problem with having nothing dash read write is if you have reads before that move into the lock, then the relative ordering between reads before the lock and reads after the lock could change. Whereas the whole intention was that reads inside the lock must be ordered with reads before the lock. As in, we're saying that the read inside the lock can't move outside, such that there's a relative ordering between those. But then having nothing dash read write would allow that reordering.
Well, couldn't the same thing be said about the writes?
It's similar with the writes, except writes are typically not reordered anyway by hardware or compilers, but technically they could be. I mean, there is some reordering in hardware, like with the store buffering and stuff, but not too much.
Yeah, it sounds like you really need like a full memory barrier when entering the exiting lock based on that explanation, right? Because you don't want writes to move in either. But yeah, anyway.
I mean, in practice, our locks today are full memory barrier on both engines.
Well, they technically they were, but we actually like Monitor, actually like the C++ version of Monitor implementation, the previous one, actually used acquire and release interlocked operations. So technically they can be interlocked operations with acquire and release ordering semantics. But the underlying implementation of them still has a full barrier because of historical reasons.
Right. I understand the specification says they don't have to be, but in practice they were, right? What you're saying.
Well, in practice, what I mean is, in practice, if you were to do interlock dot compare exchange, that implies a full barrier. Right. But if you were to do interlock dot compare exchange acquire, if such a thing were there, it doesn't have to imply a full barrier, but under the covers, the interlocked acquire in C++, even on ARM, generates a full barrier.
Sure. No, I was saying that I was just pointing out that we were talking about what can move in and out of a lock, and today in C#, a monitor like system dot monitor enter is a full barrier, correct?
Yes and no. Yes, it is.
The implementation statement.
Yeah, that's the full answer. Yeah, but like in let's say .NET 3, it would do an interlock, compare, exchange, acquire in C++, which which doesn't have to be a full barrier, but implementation-wise, it turns out to be.
Right. Right. I mean, even the ECMA specification says it doesn't have to be, but I always thought implementation-wise, it ended up being that way. It sounds like you're saying that's true.
Yeah, it's because like when we have that compare exchange loop on ARM64, like there's some paths that don't issue a barrier and some paths that do, whereas that API requires that all paths issue a full barrier. So that's why it always has a full barrier or something like that anyway.
We're a bit far afield from that.
Yeah, technically speaking, they don't have to be. Like if we were to introduce an interlock dot compare exchange acquire, it doesn't have to be a full barrier.
No, I know they don't have to be.
Right.
Speaking to we've had for the last 20 years.
Yeah.
So just getting back to my question, you'd said we would want to consider at some point we might want to consider a weaker version of, say, volatile.read barrier. That it was instead of read-read write, it was read-read. What would we call that API?
Like for those advanced kind of things, I was thinking like if we were to ever do that, we would just do that as an overload of interlock.memory barrier with different enum values that may just look like read_read.
Okay. All right.
I'm muted. Chat has asked why we don't do something like you're calling it read-read write, so let's call it read-read write, or read versus read write, or read and read write. Like, if there's a nomenclature, why don't we just spell it out?
The main reason is because that's what volatile means for reads, or acquire would also imply that.
Sure. So put it on interlocked instead of volatile. It's.
Yeah, if it's on interlock, then yeah, we'd have to be more clear about what it does.
Because that goes back to
even do
interlock has memory barrier, which is the full barrier, and so that's where I think the natural place to put other barriers would be. So, what's the name we would want to have in order to put it on interlocked? Because you're assuming that people know what volatile means. And I think there are no more than 100 people in the world who actually do. They think it means I want to read this answer, and I don't want it to have been cached in a local somewhere. Like, nobody knows what this means.
right.
I mean, to be fair, we don't really want more than those 100 people using this anyway.
Fair enough. Well, in that case, it would be interlock.memory barrier that takes an int, and if you need to know what the value of the int is, you probably already know it. It's like, this is a flag enum that we didn't tell you what the values are. So, Yeah, I mean,
I think
if we think that the proposal as proposed is the right answer, we can. But it sounds like there are other options, and we don't know if we're doing them like next year or never or what. And I'm just wondering, is there a pattern that we can do that solves the problem and doesn't make us need to care when we add future options?
the pattern that, like, if we want to do like more advanced things, I think it would apply not just to the memory barrier, but also to other things like interlock.compare exchange and all the other interlocked APIs. Well, not all of them, but at least for compare exchange. So at that point, an enum would probably make sense with more clear enum values. In this case, I don't think it's necessary to be that explicit because it's basically an explicit barrier that has similar behavior to what volatile.read does. And if you know what volatile.read does, then this is similar to that. And if you're using volatile.read barrier, I would imagine you would know what volatile.read does.
I don't know that that's true.
I know that there's also been the long-standing request for us to expose something more like C++'s standard atomic in .NET. Ben Adams opened that like 8 years ago now. And there's been requests for it before that as well, just so that we can better support looser memory models like ARM64, like ARM or RISC-V supports, as well as just generally being more flexible for when you just want to do something like a compare exchange without it necessarily having a full lock signal on Xarc across the CPU cores.
Yeah, you could even have a compare exchange that has no ordering restrictions. Of course, we can't call that just dash. Or none dash none, maybe.
Have we ever considered exposing barriers as part of intrinsics, or do we think of this as something that absolutely needs?
We have them.
We have them already.
Yeah. We've got, for example, SSE.load fence, store fence, memory fence, etc. And then there's the equivalent ones on ARM64, but those are very platform specific, and you typically want a higher level abstraction like volatile or threading interlocked exposes.
So in this context here, where do we think this lies? Is this a common enough thing that we want a cross-platform one, or do we think that's advanced enough that you may have to go to intrinsics to get what you want?
I think it's common enough that we want a cross-platform. Most other languages, especially C++, Rust, and others, provide such common cross-plat APIs. And anywhere we would use them internally, we would need a similar cross-platform API, even if it's functionally just doing the if Xarc do this, else if ARM64 do this, else if RISC-V do this. We don't want every single code site to have to type up and remember the complex logic for the 12 platforms we need to support.
That makes sense.
Alright, so are we just saying looks good as proposed?
Yep.
The only thing that seems a little bit weird to me is that it's on volatile when the memory barrier method is on threading.
It's on interlocked.
Yeah.
Technically, it's
back
also
to
on
how
We
thread.
we
deleted the
started.
ones on threading.
Well, no, we've actually got thread.memory barrier.
Yeah, looking at our source code, we say that defers to interlock.memory barrier. So that means we
Also,
think interlock is
didn't we
preferred.
obsolete the ones? Am I remembering correctly? Did we not obsolete the ones on thread, or was that just the volatile APIs?
I think that was just the volatile. It doesn't look like the memory barrier ones obsoleted.
I'm surprised by that. I thought we were basically saying people should stop, use the interlocked or volatile APIs. People should stop going to thread for those things, but maybe not.
Oh, and interlocked also has the memory barrier process wide function, so it's got two of the barriers.
All right, so that's now 3 people who have asked why these aren't on interlocked, yet Count says volatile is the place they belong. So, do we want to come up with a name that works on interlocked, or use this name on interlocked, or just leave it on volatile?
Well, so
my
in
perspective is-
interlock today we have the.
Go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say on interlock today we have an internal read memory barrier API.
Yeah, I mean, there's a long discussion on the issue about this. Oh, sorry. Like, I would have okay, I'll just say my piece. Like, I would have expected it to be on interlock too, but I'm fine with it as proposed due to like wanting to put release and acquire in the name, and that being confusing. And interlock is a pretty highly used API, like beyond the 78 people who understand that.
I mean, I'm okay with interlock dot memory barrier acquire, memory barrier release, but that'll be a new term. I'm also okay with interlock dot volatile memory barrier. Then that would be even more odd when there's a volatile class. I don't know.
Like volatile read memory barrier, volatile write memory barrier, or like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right. So the problem that I see with release and acquire, if you don't know what they mean, is it looks like
it's almost like a lock. People think it's a lock.
Yes, it looks like this is the way you're supposed to write it. Right? That acquire it and release it. And that's what it looks like to me with these names.
Is there ever a scenario where you would write code like that? Like if you really knew what you were doing? Like I know it's not a lock. but yeah.
So that's why I think it would work better with the memory barrier overload with a parameter, like a parameter called enum memory constraints. And then the memory constraints could have acquire release as shortcuts for more verbose varieties.
So in C++, they formally use the term memory order, and then they've got relaxed consume, acquire release, and then acquire release combined, and then they've got sequenced, sequentially consistent ordering. Could we just call this interlocked memory barrier and give it an enum of memory order and give it the common names that anyone who understands memory order knows, which would be things like acquire release and combined acquire release?
Yeah.
Then you don't have it in the API name, and it's very clear that it is a memory order API, and we can expand it in the future to support other barrier types.
I mean, honestly, like, I mean, are we overthinking this?
Go ahead.
Because I feel like if it, I mean, memory barriers and Volatile or Interlock, these are not APIs you just call casually because they look like something you want. So I think if people who need or think they need memory barriers, I think they kind of know what they're doing, or at least they should have a working model of what they're trying to achieve. So I mean, I kind of agree with the naming pattern here, but like, I don't think that really the biggest problem of the API.
So I would say like interlock.memory barrier isn't super common. Like interlock.increment and interlock like compare exchange are pretty common, especially like increment. So I mean, it will show up to people who are using those APIs, but maybe they would shy away from anything that starts with memory barrier anyway. The enum sounds fine
agree
though.
with that it's common, but I don't think that just because I use interlock increment, I'm looking at memory barrier, I'm like, I should sprinkle my code with those. I mean, it's not like I think unless you know what it is, I don't think you're very likely to using it because you think it does something else, right?
I think you're largely correct.
Well,
Sorry.
I think the other benefit of having an enum here is that APIs like Interlocked and Compare Exchange, frameworks like C++ provide overloads that take a memory order. We've had people asking for such support for a while. So if we go with the approach of memory barrier with taking an enum of memory order, then we have a very clear extensibility path to expose things like interlocked exchange, taking memory order, and allowing users access to the other functionality that's been asked for 8 years now.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Khan likes it too. I haven't heard anyone. Oh, there we go. Jan. It's like C++ enums are super complicated. All right, there's the objection.
Yeah, and I don't disagree that they're complicated, but this is a complicated space, and that's kind of why they're complicated.
I mean, if we're gonna do an enum, I would prefer to use names that are more clear in what the ordering restrictions are than to use all those terms, acquire, release, consume, relaxed, sequentially consistent. I mean, sequentially consistent is a bit weird because, I mean, if you do interlock.compare exchange, compare exchange implies sequential consistency on that memory location. But you're talking about the ordering restrictions relative to other operations around it. So I think the terms can make it confusing. Unless we just want to follow the same pattern. That would be a reasonable argument as well.
Well, here's the thing. We're so close to improving this API. If we do the enum thing, right, we're probably not doing it in this meeting. So I guess the question is, like, how strongly do we feel? It seems like there's some debate over, even if we did the enum, like what the values would be called. Would we copy C++ or would we try to come up with better names?
I don't think this is super critical right now.
I'm fine
so maybe we can revisit in 10, like with more alternate options.
And I was going to say, I'm fine with the APIs as proposed. My consideration here is really just like, we know that there's been long-standing requests for expanding this. We know that there's places where it'd be beneficial. And so in order to avoid kind of exposing these now and then having to expose basically an identical way to handle the APIs elsewhere later, it might be good to think about it just a little bit more holistically and see if we can answer that question. And we don't have to expose everything at once, but if we have a model that handles the long-term growth needs, then it can make the entire surface area more consistent.
So for those of us who are only smart enough to know how to chair a meeting, are we saying looks good as proposed?
I think that was a fair argument as well. We can revisit. I don't know. I'm fine either way. But I get the argument that if we were to expand on this, it would probably be as an overload of memory barrier, interlocked out memory barrier.
Yeah, I guess the question is like, how likely are we to like do a parameterized ordering thing in the future? And if we did, how sad would we be to have these like redundant APIs? I'm fine with it. I
don't
think
think I'd be overly sad to have. Yeah, I wouldn't be overly sad to have the duplicates, and it'd be no worse than some of the other duplication we already have.
I don't think you get a vote for duplicated APIs given that you own intrinsics.
Those aren't duplicated. They're unique. There's just a lot of them.
Very similar.
You've got add in every ISA.
At least their namespace usually. Yeah. All right, approve. I think I feel like no one's said not approve.
Okay, so we're adding them, and we're adding them on Volatile, and we're adding them with the current names. All this is true?
That works for me.
Okay.
I think so.
I mean, it seems to me like if you want to use these APIs meaningfully, you gotta understand the model. Like that's.
Well, that was 40 minutes. For the 78 people who understand what any of this meant, I hope you had a good time. I'm not one of you. And I wonder if this is what people feel like when I talk about crypto APIs.
Yes.
Oh.
But anyway.
Then I'm sorry.
No,
I would say I'll try not to
I
bring them
enjoy
up
learning.
anymore, but we
No, it's important.
we have reasons to. Same as
Yeah.
Count has reasons to bring up memory models. All right, so with that, thanks for sticking through with us. We had some good comments in the chat, and hopefully everybody learned something. I learned what a read-write barrier means, and by learned I mean I'll know it until I eat lunch, and then I'll forget it again. So with that, I believe we have a meeting on Thursday. Yep, looks like we're talking about tensors again. So we'll be here on Thursday. I don't even know what I just put on the screen. All right, we'll be here Thursday, same .NET time on our same .NET channel, and we'll see you then. Auf Wiedersehen.